right, so Scott, you actually sing that song that's at the beginning of some of your videos.
Oh yeah, yeah.
All right, I'm gonna make you
Uh,
sing part of it.
Wait, what? No, I'm not singing.
Welcome to the archive, or as Thor says at the beginning of every one of his videos.
Välkommen allesammans. I don't know if we should do that here, but well, people still don't understand that. But yeah, it just means welcome everybody.
Hi, my name is Dr. Scott Shell, and I'm a specialist in the Germanic languages. I have a BA in German, an MA in linguistics, and a PhD in Germanic linguistics from UC Berkeley.
You talk about runes predominantly on your channel, and you also talk about its importance academically. Can you elaborate a little bit on why, for people getting into the subject or people studying from an academic standpoint, runes, what are their importance?
Sure, yeah. I'm going to basically answer this where it's targeted towards a sort of heathen audience here. But it is very, very important, of course, to study the objective foundation of what runes are and what they mean. Because if you don't do that, then you start getting off into crazy territory, right? Basically, everything that you're experiencing subjectively is objectively valid now. And that causes a lot of issues, especially for people who are educators and they're trying to teach people, like the various heathens, for example, what runes mean, how we actually know the rune names, where do they come from, and so on and so forth. Because, for example, if you don't understand the basic objective academic information, you start practicing out of books like Ralph Bloom. If you look at Ralph Bloom, and those of you who do like Ralph Bloom, that's great. But maybe that's your particular path and you resonate with that approach. But just know that his rune names, for example, are completely wrong. So it's important to be rooted in objective fact, go out and try some things, get that subjective experience, and then that could arguably lead to a better holistic understanding of practicing runes, for example.
Okay, and so now that you've answered that for a heathen audience, can you talk about, for an academic audience, the importance in finding roots or core of a culture?
So from an academic perspective, runology is actually an interdisciplinary field. And the reason it is because when we look at these runic inscriptions, we want to understand the Germanic cultures, right? And also the Scandinavian cultures. When I say Germanic, I also mean Scandinavian. And when we do that, that allows us to understand maybe some social hierarchies. It allows us to understand their conception of the world. That's a huge one. It's really important, I think, to at least know when you're projecting something that's a modern view onto something that was 1,000, 2,000 years ago, versus trying to just understand how the culture worked 1,000 or 2,000 years ago. That's very important. But the reason I'm saying it's interdisciplinary is because it's like, I am a linguist. I focus on the language. That is only a quarter of what it takes for interpretation of runic inscriptions. So you have to take into consideration the archaeological evidence, for example. You have to take into consideration the way that runes are executed. You have to take into consideration the timeline, in which case would be, of course, the linguistics behind it. And so basically taking into consideration all those different approaches and all those different fields, that is what's going to help us to understand a better Germanic worldview. And in fact, my dissertation was basically on that, where I talked about a lot of these runic inscriptions, but I really emphasized the idea that you should be focused on something called the Weltanschauung, which is the world view of a people, to really understand how it was that they thought.
Very cool. And yeah, so important to get into that. Like you said, it's the runes are just one part of it, but I have some questions we'll go over there that's going to kind of not only teach us about the runes and how they were used, but about those cultures from ancient times when there is no real written evidence about what was going on back then, or what they thought and how they lived. So and the runes can absolutely help with that.
Yeah, they can. They can definitely help with that, especially when you start looking into the old rune poems. There's the Old English rune poem, the Old Norwegian rune rhyme, the Old Icelandic rune poem. There actually is an early modern Swedish rune poem that just came to light, that was published in the Rune Poems: A Reawakened Tradition. So if anybody wants to check out a translation of that, It's also treated very scholarly by Michael Moynihan. So I think that the community should, both heathen and academic, should really know about that work, because the early modern Swedish rune poem is not very much discussed. But yeah, all those rune poems also help inform us of the rune meanings too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we'll get into those. Is there any other questions you had, Garrett, for the start of it before we get into the academic stuff?
Before we get into the real academic stuff, yeah. So there's a lot of multi-meanings in runes. Could both of you elaborate on that, like why there's so many meanings tied just to one rune specifically?
Do you want to take this, Thor?
So this is difficult. 90% of that comes from modern times, unfortunately. 90% of what the average person is going to see out there in the internet, the rune names and the symbolism and the meanings behind that, it's been made up in the last 20, 30, 60, even 100 years.
Okay, and not to smash on Ralph Bloom, did this start with him, or does
no. This goes back to the 1800s. Some of the scholars back then, even they were coming up with their own interpretations that some of them are very good, but some of them didn't necessarily have much basis in the historical what we know. So that's the difference. But it's important just people know the difference. Of course, it's cool to have interpretations, but knowing which ones are actually ancient and which ones are not.
Okay, and were these like bias from the times because people were looking back on their history or these cultures and going, oh, look at these silly people? Or was this also something like we're just taking a crack at it and we're trying to figure out what these mean? They're trying to get some definitive answers on this.
Yeah, what do you think, Scott? You know a lot more about that than me, probably. The early 1800s, 1900s.
Yeah, the answer is actually really simple. So the short answer is they would sometimes associate rune meanings with other words that look like, for example, Soilo, the S rune, might look like it's related to Sieg, as in like Sieg, victory, and Zeke, sorry. And that's not true. It's actually not related to that at all. But what would happen in these earlier times, because linguistics hadn't quite developed enough yet, especially for a wider audience besides outside of Grimm, for example, and Rasmus Rask, they would sometimes say that these words must have been associated with these runes. And it was sometimes guesswork, more often than not, actually. That's one approach, but the other approach too is that, for example, with like rune sounds, you hear about this from like Friedrich Marby, for example, with like rune sounds, they would associate the rune name and just the rune sound, like the initial S sound, with a concept, right? And so that comes a little bit later. But I must point out too that the whole idea of like runic yoga, everyone wants to say it's very modern. Sure, but if you also look at the Horn of Gallius, for example, you do have human figures there shaped as runes. So that's something to contemplate as well. But yeah, like Thor was saying, most of it does come from that era. It's particularly like Johannes Burius, around that particular era. Yeah. Also, some modern practitioners and scholars, they'll also want to associate these rune names. They want to look at basically semantic distributions, and so what they'll do is they'll look at a word like fehu, like the F rune, and they'll look and see where it occurs in all these different spots and throughout the text, and they'll create like a semantic field. That's actually giving a lot of credit, I guess, where most people probably don't do that, especially in the modern world, but there are a couple esoteric scholars out there that do that kind of work. So hopefully that answers the question.
Good.
I think so. Thor, you have any questions for Scott now?
Yeah, so it's we're focusing most of this episode on the origin of the runes and their ancient uses versus the modern uses. So we want to, this is a very long subject and it's debated in the scholarly community, but What is your quick thoughts, Scott, on the origin of the runes? Is it italic alphabets imported, or is it just influence, or what can you say quickly about where the runes came from and what time and how that may have happened, most likely scenario?
Oh, that is honestly a really hard question.
Mhm.
So I'll just, I'll keep it short, but basically I adhere to more of the Latin principle. So you do have the Etruscan idea, right, where it comes from the Etruscans, and that it has some valid evidence for that too. But you have the Greek theory as well. But yeah, no, typically, long story short, I kind of adhere to the Latin side of things, only to a degree though. Because if you look at a lot of the forms, and Thor, I'll go ahead and email you something where it actually shows each form and each sound and how it directly correlates to each Roman letter. So you
Yeah,
can show it on the screen, hopefully.
yeah, yeah.
And you'll see that there are a lot of similarities. However, there are some runes where it's like it doesn't look anything like a Roman character, and it also doesn't have like an equivalent Roman sound or something like that. And so then I would say that some of them are probably innovated. So it's kind of like this hybrid idea, basically, where it's like I believe it was probably Roman influence, but also there was still some internal inspiration or something to create new runes and new concepts and new sounds.
Yeah, definitely. And it's what do you think? Is it as simple as, the Germanic tribes being hired as mercenaries for Rome and them picking up the, different alphabets from them that way? Or do you think there's something more than that that goes further back than the time that they were being
I think it was
hired as
really more of the
mercenaries?
former, because if you look at some of the oldest runic inscriptions, they're down in the south, and then they gradually move up. Right. We have
Hmm.
some very old inscriptions, in Scandinavia, but honestly, a lot of those inscriptions are mostly later, right?
Yeah.
With a few exceptions. So it's hard to say, but it appears like there was some sort of something going on down there in the south. And because we even find inscriptions, for example, in Switzerland, and it just kind of moved up. But I do believe too that here's the big thing too. People want to think that runes were like meant for everyone, and that's not the case. So it was actually the rune master, in which case I still adhere to that title as a rune master, um, was taught these things. And then they taught them to maybe another learner or something like that. The entire community did not know how to read runes.
Hmm.
And it was meant for a specific type or class of a person. Um, and yeah, I mean, it's a little bit different too than just like, oh, I'm going to go copy this alphabet and just write it down and give it to this next person. Because too, if you look at the runic tradition, if you look at all the rune poems, you'll see that there's all this lore in there, right? You have these poems like the old English rune poem, the old Norwegian rune rhyme, and the old Icelandic rune poem, which clearly encodes a lot of information, which is really even tied to mythic stories. And so when you had this one rune master going on to teach another learner, he wasn't just giving him an alphabet. Okay, like I want to make that very clear, because that's actually where academic thought, they don't really want to talk about that too much. They want to say Latin alphabet, runes, one-to-one correlation, that's it. And that's simply not true. So when this rune master was teaching this information, he was also passing on lore. He was passing on mythic lore as a mnemonic
Hmm.
device, sure, but it was more than just A is for apple. I mean, you're talking about Os is, I can't remember the exact line off the top of my head, but the old father in Asgard and the ruler of Valhalla. You have this very elaborate stanza, and if it was just mnemonic, I kind of feel like that would kind of get in the way. Well, why would we say like A is for apple that hangs on a tree down the street from my house? Like, why would we make it so elongated, if it was actually just purely a mnemonic system? So yeah, I believe that there's a little this it's not just a straight answer, but that's kind of what I'm trying to say, is that rune master learner, rune master's teaching learner, that learner becomes a rune master who teaches another couple of people who are initiated and understand the mythic structures and all that stuff.
So I guess that's you kind of answered my next question there. The question was kind of at its origins when they were first starting to being used. Was it more of a writing system, or was the symbolism of each rune already there before they maybe started using it in writing?
That is hard to say, but what I will say is that we have definitive proof that some of these runes were used as like ideographic concepts even before the rune poems. So, for example, the Saint Often stone has the Yara rune, which means good harvest, and it means that symbolically. So, as far as like when did all of them pick up their meanings, that's impossible to determine. But I would say that it wasn't like it was probably at the same time, because again, they were mnemonic devices to a degree, and they needed to remember the order of the runes and everything. So it probably developed around the same time that they adopted the system and or kind of created their system. So
Yeah, and we spoke about this a little bit before through text message when we were speaking about this episode. What are some of the earliest runic inscriptions, and what is so special about those from the later ones, and what were they used for? Because I think you say you did your PhD thesis on something like that?
I did. I mean, I could talk about some of the oldest inscriptions if you want, or I could just refer
Couple
your
examples.
viewers actually to my Thorsberg Moor video, because in my Thorsberg Moor video, I was actually there talking about the oldest inscriptions. But yeah, in my dissertation, I did focus on all the Elder Futhark inscriptions. Well, 9 of them actually. Yes, that number was intentional. So I would say it's probably easier just to talk about my favorite one. I mean, it's like very old, but it's also in Norway. So it's the Egya runestone. The Egya runestone is completely fascinating. I absolutely love it. It's very old. I think it's dated to about well, it's sort of, this is why it's interesting. It's sort of old, sort of not, because I think it's dated to about 800 or so. However, the language is in classical Old Norse, but the written system is the Elder Futhark. And that's really cool. It is not a transitional inscription. I do not adhere to that idea. It's too late for that. And you see the word land spelled, for example, L-A-T, which you would actually expect in Old Norse, but you also see it spelled L-A-N-D, I believe. So you have, all these variations and everything. But what's really cool about that inscription, though, is it says that, this inscription was not carved with an iron knife, meaning it was carved, with maybe a stone chisel or something like that, with a really thick hardness stone chisel, and it was carved at night, so the sun never touched it. And there's alliteration all over the place, which ties into magic too. So we'll talk about that as well. And it's a stone that was meant for psychopomp work. So basically, there was an entity that came in and kind of spiritually guided them to the other world. And so it's really cool. There are lots of interpretations with this stone, but again, I focused on it on my dissertation. So I did a lot of research on it. So I'm very much adhering to that idea. And it's just a really cool stone. More to the point, it was also flipped upside down and on purpose, and it was meant for the dead, like obviously with like the psychopomp work that's tied into it.
And then not supposed to uncover it under the waning moon, right? You don't let it expose to that. It says something like that.
Something like that, yeah. And again, it also depends on which interpretation you're going off of. But yeah, it does say that too. And more importantly, though, too, there are a few items buried under the stone. And so it wasn't really a grave, but what I did argue for is that it was like some sort of like metonymic burial. So let's say you were lost at sea and your family members were distraught because they could not give you a proper burial, but they had some of your things that were connected to you. And so they buried them there over the stone. So, because actually the stone talks about that too. It's a capsizing where people died at sea. So it's a really cool inscription. Just real briefly, the Lindholm amulet is also very old. I think off the top of my head, it's about the 3rd century. That's a really interesting inscription. It's written on a piece of bone found in a bog. And it says that I am the crazy one. I am the wily one. I am called the Erelaz, which is a rune master. But yeah, I can go on and on about all these different inscriptions. If you want me to, I will. We can just
please go into it.
Oh, cool. All right. So there's The Bjorkatorp inscription is also one of my favorites. I absolutely loved this one. So I'll send you some pictures for this too, so you can post them in the video. They're my own personal pictures because I actually went there. And when I went there for research purposes, sort of. So I went there for research purposes. That's how I got funding. And I went there and basically there's this triangle of stones and they stand like, oh my gosh, probably like 14 feet high. And what's really cool is that you'll notice that the one with the inscription is a big, it's basically just like a triangle, but the one with the inscription is in the north. I don't think that was an accident. It's basically built on a grave field. So it's really, really close to a grave field, even though there's not any bodies underneath the actual stone. I believe that it was meant for the whole grave field. And basically what it says is anybody who breaks this stone is going to be subject to a curse. So basically you come into contact with the stone or any other stones surrounding the area, like the grave area. And if you disturb it, then a curse is going to trigger and you will be impacted by that curse. So that's the Bjorkatorp stone. And I also did some personal work around that stone too. So this is it's really a fascinating inscription.
And yeah, that's super cool. That's 3 of them that you spoke about there, and people don't realize sometimes how much they can learn from looking at these old runic inscriptions, especially the Egya stone.
Yeah.
You get 4 or 5, 6, maybe 10 things that teaches you about their spirituality and how you should be carving runes in the proper historical way. Like, don't use an iron knife, for example. Don't let it be touched by the sun.
So let me say something about that real quick. Yeah, because the whole "don't cut this with an iron knife" thing is actually tied into folklore. I talked about this throughout the dissertation too. How you would go out, it was like you would go out and cut a branch off of a tree, but you had to cut it without an iron knife and before the sun came up. So actually it's a deep tradition, I believe, that whatever that rune master was practicing within those parameters. But also to tie this into magic, like I said, there's alliteration everywhere. It's like, I'm not going to go into it, but yeah, basically alliteration is 10 terrible Tuesdays, or, but in Egya, it basically says like, do not carve this while the sun is out, and do not use an iron knife, and do not, it's like this repetition. And you find that a lot in magical practices too. Even as something as simple as like when you were little, you might say like, rain, rain, go away, come again another day. Like you have all this repetition, and you also have semantic repetition and sound repetition. And that ties very closely into a lot of magic practices.
All right. So now I'm going to barge in and start with saying, can the both of you define magic in your own words? Or from your studies?
Yeah.
Too much of a question.
Well, I can say a lot about that. So do you want to just talk about it for?
I just recently, I was on another podcast last week and kind of formed my thoughts into the shortest way possible. The old religions are trying to explain, understand, and interpret the nature and the universe and the forces all around us. Magic and ritual is trying to influence or even control those forces in some way.
Yeah,
and that's the shortest answer.
No, I actually really like that. I really do. It's you could probably even say using the will basically to kind of control universe too. But I really like that. If I had to give it my own personal definition, I would agree with that too. The thing is that when it comes to magic, it's a huge can of worms. And I know this because my dissertation was actually called "The Application of Persian Semiotics." I'm already forgetting my own title. Establishing parameters of magical communication. And so I actually talked a lot about magic, because the problem is that as a scholar, you can imagine, I walk into a conference and I'm like, I'm going to talk about runes and magic. They're like, they're already judging me. I mean, I know this 100%. They're like, oh, this guy's just nuts. And it was really tough to deal with, because the only person who supported me talking about magic was actually my advisor. And that's honestly all I needed. I just needed my advisor, but the whole department was just like, whatever. They were just messing with me about the whole time. And what I had to make clear, and what I want to make clear in this video for everybody listening, is that when we're talking about magic, we're not talking about Harry Potter. We're not talking about cheap parlor tricks where we're pulling rabbits out of hats, although that could be construed as magic too because of illusion. But either way, what I had to do was go through and figure out how to talk about magic and runology. And because if I just talk about magic and runes, there's absolutely not a single scholar out there who wants to hear about it. But I finally got one to listen to me, and he actually thought that what I had to say had some merit, and that was actually Henrik Williams. And the reason why is because I pulled it way out of the subjective context, and I said, all right, I asked everybody in the room, I said, what does magic mean? I could have gotten 42 different answers. And I said, well, let's just narrow it down. Let's at least pay some homage to the fields which have studied this. So let's look at Emil Durkheim and Marcel Mauss. Let's look at how they define magic in a sociological context. The person is very asocial, for example. He's kind of the weirdo who's out there on the limits, of the village that nobody talks to and nobody goes to because he's kind of just strange. But the people in the community need some help, and so they go to him. That's very different than someone who sits here and does a rune reading. It's very different. But outside of Marcel Mauss, you also have people like Malinowski, who says that the purpose of magic is to sort of vent emotions. So that's another completely different approach. You have another approach, which is older, but I still think it's worth knowing about, by Fraser, for example, who says it starts off as the society starts off as a magic believing sort of society, and then quote unquote evolves into religion, and then quote unquote evolves into science. That's a problem. And he also says that they're all just stupid. I mean, he literally does. He calls them dumb-witted savages. So, but he does have some interesting theories on when he talks about magic and says like, oh, magic's involved when you touch an object and then you touch another thing and there's a relationship. So he has some interesting ideas. But my point in bringing all this up is that the study of magic should be taken seriously and not just thrown around. Like, when I talk about magic, I don't want someone to think that I'm trying to, say Wingardium Leviosa and make something float. It's not that. And, so there's emotionalist approaches, there are sociological approaches, there are evolutionist approaches, there are semiotic approaches, there is actually even a linguistic approach to it. There are all these different approaches. And if we think, I think that if we can at least understand where all of these authors are coming from with what does magic mean, I think we would be far like light years ahead, instead of just thinking about magic and thinking about, like I said, like Harry Potter or something like that. And I would recommend a book to your readers too. It's called Defining Magic. So I'll go ahead and send you a link for that. Yeah. It's fantastic. It really just widened my understanding of magic so much, just starting with that. But it's just a nice big reader, in which case talks about all those people very briefly, like Marcel Mauss, Emil Durkheim, and Malinowski, and several others.
Yeah. Thank you, Scott. Don't use an iron knife. Is there something specific about iron that when coming in contact with wood or organic material?
I think, Thor and I talked about this before, other than just knowing that, for example, with spirits and them not liking iron, that's all I can really say. I mean, we know that, for example, when you throw iron at a spirit, it's supposed to go away. So it's supposed to deter them. So you typically want to do that with spirits that are obviously not welcoming. So with the Aegir runestone, it was probably just another method of just keeping bad spirits away. But beyond that, again, we just don't really know. I don't like to speculate a whole lot because if I don't know, I just don't really know. Sorry if I'm not quite answering the question.
It's one of those things too. It's like, okay, some things, herbal medicine, for example, humans have been doing that for thousands of years, and we figure out that, okay, they were right now that we know the modern scientific explanation why that does that stuff. And some things we don't know, some things we're figuring out. Not claiming that every magic practice that ancient humans did is right, but we know some of it is, and some of it might be, and also some of it may be impossible to tell. But it was at least a reality for them back then. Maybe they didn't believe it worked 100% of the time, it just helped. also if people around the world tend to do similar things, or even the exact same things, cultures who have never come into contact with each other, then that makes me believe that there's something more there. But
Yeah.
everybody has to decide what they believe in and what makes sense to them. When we say we believe in magic, it's not like we believe in all of it, just some things that we have enough evidence that makes us believe that.
And again, it depends on how you're defining it. You know, if you ask me, do I believe that something's going to appear out of thin air? No, I don't. But like, you know, it depends on how you're using it. As you said before, Thor, about using your will, we could also say about using your hamingya, right? About using the internal forces within you to maybe influence the universe. I'm very sort of self-oriented rather than community-oriented. So
we spoke about that, and I know we wanted to touch on that, the Haminya related to the runes and the rune master. Haminya is of course a word that we see coming up in Old Norse, so it's quite late. But how do you think that played into the rune masters, going from the Viking Age to the migration period and even before, and to these earliest inscriptions of runes?
well, a hamingya is described as a sort of like personal inborn luck, right? It's also, I should say, arguably, it's basically hammer, which is basically the shape goer. It's kind of interesting because it's like hammer and then like ganga, in which case it's like the hammer goer. And so the hammer is a part of the soul complex system, right? It's part of the physical shape, but it's not the leak. It's not the actual body. It's something that actually gives something some sort of physical shape, the physical substance, if you will. And what we might know is that this sort of, so if going to Havamal now real quick, you know, you have like, do you know how to carve? Do you know how to color? It was actually just recently brought to my attention that it might not even mean, do you know how to color, but it's like, do you know how to grasp or catch them, which was kind of interesting too. But, you know, do you know how to color? Do you know how to sacrifice? Do you know how to ask? Do you know how to basically interact with these things? I think that also ties into Haminya, which could also be tied back to the runes too, because you are putting the proverbial blood, sweat, and tears into the inscription. And you are sort of, this is sort of going to come out now. It's not quite academically based, but this is how I sort of resonate with things. When you're inscribing things and you're carving things and you're coloring things with runic inscriptions, you're literally sort of infusing it with your haminya, your personal luck, your inborn personal luck. And that's part of what energizes the entire inscription. So that's like I said, that's part of my subjective, you know, experiences. But historically, because I know your viewers want to know about some historical evidence for that. Well, what we can say is that, for example, the word Erelaz is not Earl. People want to say it's Earl. It's not Earl. The reason why is because it's Erelaz. It's not Erelaz, it's Erelaz. There's a different, what's called like an ablaut variant. Long story short, it does actually, it's connected to something which means to rise up. So it's when somebody is an Erelaz, I believe that it's someone who is in a different state. It's someone who does rise up. This is talked about by Jan de Vries, for example. He connects those two things. So going back to
and for the viewers who don't know, by the way, Ek Erilaz is found on a lot of these runic inscriptions, basically just as like an introduction, like me, Erilaz, carve these runes or something like that, for those who don't know.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. And also, I don't believe it's tied to the Heruli either, because the distribution of those formulas is all over Scandinavia and all over Germany. And it's a widespread distribution. So if it was actually connected to the tribe, the Heruli, it doesn't make sense for it to have such a wide distribution. But yeah, to answer your question though, it's like, it's hard to say, like, was it Haminya? I don't know. I mean, but we do know that, for example, that whoever did these inscriptions, if we do agree that it meant to rise up mentally and to perform these inscriptions, there's something else going on there rather than just some profane writing, you know, Scott was here, you know, it's a little bit more than that.
Do you think it was, I guess a lot of people are going to ask that question next too. Do you think it was, can anyone just come into this and carve runes and get effect out of it? Or was it specifically meant for one person who has had a very long training, or maybe even some special abilities that did these things in old times?
Here's the thing. I honestly believe that it was meant for a specific type of audience. If you're interested in runes and you want to go out and learn runes, that's cool. But if you look at Egil Saga, for example, or Egil Saga, you'll see, for example, Egil is actually referred to as a rune master in that saga. And there is, for example, someone who is very sick, and then someone comes along and tries to cure this girl by writing a runic inscription on it, and it fails. And it specifically fails because he doesn't know his stuff very well. So Egil comes along as an actual true rune master, carves the correct inscription, however he did that specifically, and then the girl is healed. So yeah, I do honestly believe that it's meant for a specific type of person. Maybe somebody who's very dedicated and just, you know, someone who's very serious about it, because again, that's just not my opinion, and I'm not trying to play gatekeeper here. So I want to be clear on that too. But I'm just saying, you know, if you're going to do something like that, just be serious about it and just, you know, do as much research as you can. And but yeah, to answer your question in short, I mean, even the texts tell us that not everybody was really able to do it. I mean, it was only meant for the most dedicated and, you know, most respected rune masters, I guess you could say.
And you don't have to, it's not something you have to dedicate your life to, just carving runes and all that, because Egil, first and foremost, was just a badass warrior.
Oh yeah,
from the strongest of the whole Viking Age. So he wasn't sitting around like a spiritual leader, all peaceful, carving runes all day. It was just one of his side
but also notice too that
he
was also the weirdo, the asocial guy, right, that we were talking about beforehand. So yeah, but yeah, no, he wasn't, like you said, like some sort of like spiritual Gothi or something like that. But we do know that he was a rune master, and he was able to do it and other people weren't, because he had probably better training or something. I don't know.
Yeah. So I guess that the last question I wanted to get into is,
Outdoor, can I ask one quick question?
Yeah, do you want to ask one here now?
Yeah, it's just about magic. Were some of these stories written not just to say that magic's only for certain people, but to warn what would happen if the wrong person was using magic or attempting to use magic?
So yeah, I mean, you could look at it as a warning. You know, it definitely could look at it as a warning, especially in Egil Saga. But you know, also look at the way that Odin talks about the runes in Havamal too. Like, he has Lodfafnir. That is his, that name could be actually translated as apprentice, shaggy pants or something like that. It's like, but I've seen, you know, people argue for it to mean apprentice. And sorry, I'm like moving my camera, but and you know, so he has to teach him how to do these things. And you know, he teaches them how to carve, he teaches them how to sacrifice, he teaches them how to perform bloat, he teaches them all these different things. And then Odin also says, some are among the elves, some are among the Aesir, right? And I've carved some for myself. It doesn't necessarily say like, and I have given the runes for everybody in the universe to use with no consequence. So that does not say that whatsoever. And in fact, you have the whole teacher learner dynamic right there in the poem. But yeah, I mean, just in simplistic terms, I mean, if you mess up the inscription and it's a curse, it's not going to work, or at least in theory, it's not going to work. If you know, let me put it in perspective for some of the people who are even practicing. Like, if you carve a Proto-Germanic word and use the Elder Futhark, and you don't know what you're really doing, you know, if you spell the word, I don't know, for Dagas or something, but you actually spell it as like doggy or something like that, it's actually just not going to be that effective. Sure, intent is important, but I don't think it's going to be that effective, because it's not even accurate, you know, as to what you're doing. I think you should be rooted academically and then branch out from there. But you know, that's just kind of me saying, you know, it probably wouldn't be that effective. But again, I don't know what else to really say to that, other than just, yeah, we have sources that say that rune masters should be doing this the right way, and if they don't, there are consequences. But I'm trying to think of some older stones. I mean, the only thing that I can think of is just like the curse stones, where it's like, if anybody screws up, you know, one of these gravestones, you're going to be cursed. there's that. There's but there's nothing there that says like, you need to perform this the right way. I mean, there are actually ritual instructions. I would categorize that. Actually, now I'm thinking about it, it's like ritual instructions that you have to follow step by step. So if you look into like the folklore material, there are instructions. So if this does help answer the question, there are instructions where it says like you need to find this particular bird. And when you find this particular bird, I think it was actually a raven. When you find the raven, you need to kill the raven. It has to be a raven. You have to drill a hole through its heart. And you need to be able to basically find the disease by looking through the heart of a raven. So we do have things like that with like these ritual instructions. So if they found a sparrow and they did the same thing, presumably it wouldn't work. So I guess we do have, ritual instructions like that, but it's not as prevalent as I would like them to be. That's for sure.
What could you say about, I've thought about this a lot, and a lot of people have asked this question. When you're carving runes, if you start to do that, how big of a effect, how big of a difference does it have on the item that it's carved on? Because of course we have a ton of sources for this. It's been carved on just normal boulders, stones, amulets, bones, whale bones, all those types of things. What do you think? Does it matter specifically? Does it have any difference on the effect as to what item it's being carved on, based on what? There's few sources of it, of course, but anything that you found that maybe can give us some clues about that?
Yeah, of course, material is very important. But it also comes down to, again, the intent. Are you trying to make it last longer? Are you trying to turn it into something that's a memorial? In other words, like when you create these rune stones, you want them to last, right? These are memorial stones. So why would you do that on a piece of flat wood, when you want it to actually last? So that's one example. Another example is, if you want like an immediate effect, I find this kind of interesting. This comes from Sigurd Drifelmal. If you want an immediate effect and you carve it onto wood, and then you want to sort of deliver the message quickly, you can shave off the runes into the horn and then drink the horn. So that's a totally different intent. So I think it all just really depends on whatever your intent is. If it's on bone, is it on bone on purpose? It probably is on bone on purpose, because I actually have tried these different things. That's also what makes me different from your standard academic. I have carved on wood, I have carved on bone, I've carved on stone. And I'll tell you what, when it comes to granite and you see 10 runes written in a row and an academic tells you that was for practice, I say, I can't even say that word. So, because it's insane. Okay, it's insane, because if you have ever gone out with a hammer and a chisel and you try practicing 10 of the same rune on a granite stone, rather, it's really hard. So I'm going to practice in dirt, or maybe on wood or something like that. So I would say to those kinds of inscriptions too, that are like written on stone and they have 10 runes written in a row, I don't think that that's practice. Why would you do that? Like, it just doesn't make sense. And again, this is coming from someone who has carved a few rune stones myself, just to sort of see, what it's like to, like I said towards the beginning of the video, putting yourself in that worldview, understanding what it's like to do these things, understanding the stress, that one is under, to just use a hammer and a chisel, not like a Dremel tool, actually doing the work. And if it's a bone, I think it was also intentional. Like the Lindholm amulet that I talked about earlier, where I said that the rune master and the crazy one, I'm called the wily one, actually. It actually is a bone that was shaped like some sort of serpent or fish. And the deposit, it was found in a bog. So some sort of like watery area. So I think there is obviously connection there. There's the bone, it's shaped like a fish, and it's deposited and thrown into a watery area, a bog. So yeah, I believe the material that one chooses is extremely important. I mean, it all comes down to really the intent.
That's a really, really fascinating subject, and yeah, even just you speaking there gave a few more ideas for people. But there's probably dozens of things that you can dozens of conclusions that you can make from those types of evidence and archaeological finds, but it's I don't know if there's any books on it, but yeah, that would be a really interesting area of research to do.
Yeah, and it's just all loose references here and there, but yeah.
If the last question, this can take a while too, so that'll be my last one. Is there any differences that you see from the way runes were used at different times? If we go back to the Germanic tribal age around the migration era, that these earliest runic inscriptions, as to how they were used in the Viking age, and even into the folk tradition, just a few hundred years ago, and as they were used today. So it's a long subject,
question, yeah, but actually I love the question.
We can start between
because,
like the earliest runic inscriptions and the Viking age, so
sure,
that period of 700-800 years.
So it's a great question, because initially when I was talking about the rune master, so like we're going to start in the very early periods, right? The rune master and the learner, and how it was sort of restricted to a small group of people. That was very different. If we look in the oldest inscriptions, they weren't memorial stones. A lot of it wasn't memorial stones. It wasn't graffiti like so-and-so was here. And it also wasn't used. They weren't used for grocery lists. They weren't used for a lot of profane things. A lot of the things that the elder tradition consisted of were these older sort of like things that were tied to myth. And let me say this real quick too, because this is a question that I do get asked a lot too, especially from an academic perspective. They always say, well, Scott, aren't runes the exact same thing as the Latin alphabet? Have you heard that before? Yeah. No, they're not. And that's also not a popular answer. But let me explain, because before, an academic throws me under the bus again. So the thing is that if the intent is to write runes and write some sort of magical formula on it, and that's the intent, will the magical formula work? Presumably, sure. If somebody takes a lead tablet and writes in Greek on it, there's a curse there, this is historically attested all over the place, and they write a curse on this lead tablet and they throw it down the well and it breaks. Will the curse work? Again, presumably yes, but it's a different alphabet, right? Well, the thing is that the reason why I don't equate them one to one is because you cannot remove the mythic context from the runes. There's no mythic context with the Roman system when they brought it to the tribes. Their mythic system was after they were already Christian. So you cannot get rid of the fact that when you're dealing with these runes and you're inscribing these things, you're still working within a mythic context, in the sense that that Odin had thought up these runes, that Odin had sacrificed himself on the tree to win these runes, about all of the sagas, and actually Sigurd Riefemal, how runes are written on the beak of an owl and runes are written on the Sleipnir's teeth, like all these really beautiful, interesting imageries. And then, there are even instances where it's literally like they basically say that they're carved out and dispersed throughout the universe. So it's like, they're not the same thing, because you cannot, basically talk about runes without any mythic context. So I just wanted to say that real quick. Moving forward, if we go into the younger Futhark period, though, here's where things start to become a little more profane. So more and more people start learning how to do runes and how to use runes, and they start using them for, initially, it's just like, there's still like these curse formulas here and there in the transition period. But then after that, you get into the younger period, and people always like to talk about the Bergen inscriptions, and they use the Bergen inscriptions as evidence for runes being used in a profane manner, no magic, not just an Erelaz could write them, and so on and so forth. But what I would say is that is way later. We're talking like almost 1,000 years later, and the intent and the purpose of those runes were completely different. You do still have Erelaz formulas here and there, but when you start getting into the Bergen inscriptions and stuff like that, it's very clear, because that's where you actually find like the grocery lists and stuff like that. It's very clear that the intent is very different. I wouldn't say that it be turned into a degenerate system. I would just say that the use of the runes sort of shifted. I mean, you still had people who were recording runes and using runes in magic in the younger Futhark period, but it's also mixed up again with all these other profane, all the profane imagery too. So with the Anglo-Saxon system, I'm not really an expert on that one, but I will say that what they did is they expanded their Futhark system, and it did become more profane. I'll just leave it at that. It did become more profane, but they still have some magical uses too. But the most sort of sacred examples that we have are from the oldest inscriptions.
Yeah, makes sense. It really makes sense, and that ties a lot of the evidence together. And would you say it even turned into something like, in the oldest runic inscriptions, was it kind of one tribal elder or rune master that did it back then, but as we get to the Viking Age, it was everybody kind of giving it a shot and kind of losing understanding, and kind of one of those things.
Exactly. Probably, not everybody remembered all the rune poems or something like that. They were using it in more of a profane manner rather than just the sort of like teacher learner idea. In which case, the benefits to that is it started to expand literacy. The downside to it is that it became something more profane and less sacred. So,
and I guess really quickly, just tying that into the rune use in more modern times. That's a huge subject too, but a lot of people are going to want to know that. What would be the differences between how runes were used 1,000 years ago versus how a lot of people are using them today, and these authors in the past 150 years have started using them, and how would people be able to tell the difference between what is more of a modern interpretation versus what was actually historical?
Well, years of research.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm half joking, half not. It actually does require you to do a lot of work. And honestly, it's like, I find that a lot of people who want to, practice this spiritually, that's great for them and they can do what they want. But the thing is that when you're not rooted, again, in everything I talked about in this video, if you're not rooted in the sort of objective fact, historical basis, then everything just becomes subjective. And I'm sorry, but if you're teaching your subjective beliefs to someone as an objective argument, that is a problem, because that is really the definition of a guru. And, I try to approach this, especially in my channel, where it's like I told you before, I'm very personal with everything I do. I'm very active as a sort of practitioner, but it's nobody else's business. And honestly, I don't think it would really benefit anybody to know what it is that I do, because I would be doing exactly what I just said, right? As far as like teaching people my subjective experiences and making me feel like some sort of guru. That's not what I'm here for. And so that's why my channel is very objectively based, where I try to push people to do their own things, but be rooted in the objective fact. So as far as, it's going to depend on the individual. If you're very dedicated, I mean, you're going to go out and research these things and then sort of build your own worldview from there. But, I mean, there are certain authors that I would say to stay away from, but I don't want to cause any bad blood here on your channel. So, but there are certain,
I'll do it in another video.
You know what? Honestly, maybe another video we can talk about modern rune authors. That would be really interesting.
Yeah. That would be a good subject for another
because
video.
As much as I study the academic stuff, I also study the esoteric stuff. So, anyway, but how do they know though? Well, I can tell you this. Take this away. We do know historically that when using rune magic in this oldest attestations, there was always an emphasis of repetition, almost always an emphasis of repetition. So if you are one thing too, don't go out and buy runes. Okay. If you want to buy runes and you want them to be all like decorative and stuff, that's great, but they're not going to have the same effect that they do when you put your own will and your own haminya into these things. And we do know that historically, because we've already covered that in this video. That would be my first recommendation. And then my second one would be, again, about the repetition. So if you want, I'll give you a historical example here. Perfect. We have the Gumarp runestone, where we have the Fehu rune written 3 times. It clearly means, and I talked about this in my dissertation too, it clearly means wealth, 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 or something like to that effect. And if there's an inscription, I think it's meant for a memorial of some sort. But what's more important is that it's the fehu, because it's repeating wealth, 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 but it's also repeating the sound. Like you have all these different sounds, fehu, 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 wealth, wealth, wealth. And you have, a piece of historical evidence right there if your audience wants it. So it's a repetition of sounds, repetition of semantics. That's very common. Sometimes too, you'll see that they assume other identities. Like I said too, with the Ek Erelaz formula, it says, I am called the Rune Master. I am called the Crazy One. I do not believe that it means the sunny one, but that's a linguistic argument. I do believe it means the crazy one. And so they sort of like rise up again into this sort of different mode of thinking. And then you look at the backside of the bone, the other side of the Lindholm amulet, and it has this crazy elaborate formula on it with all these repeated runes, and then it ends with Alu, in which case that's a totally different video to talk about whatever Alu means. But like, so there's that. You could take that away from it, maybe sort of like rising up, taking on this sort of like higher self or something like that, depending on how you interpret it. But my idea is not mine alone. And there are several scholars out there who talk about this all over the place. Curse formulas were also very common. So if you had a stone, like I think you can see the stone right there. It's actually a fun little Kensington rune stone replica. But if you take this stone here and you write on it all in runes, don't touch this thing. If you do and you break it, then you'll be subject to ergi or something like that, like perversity, however you want to define that word. But that's another common formula. But to make that even more powerful, what you would do, this is going back to the Bjorkatorp runestone, because this is exactly from there. You would write the formula on the stone, and then you would have it alliterate and not rhyme. Rhyming is actually not Germanic, by the way. You would have it alliterate, like with the 10 terrible Tuesdays, the initial alliteration. And then you would sort of encode a curse formula on that with all the alliteration, and maybe even a curse word like Alu or something like that. And that, if you are trying to be 100% historical, that would be a very good example of something like that.
Yeah, very, very fascinating. Yeah, so we've covered so much, but we've just touched on it. Really, you can see why
There's
so many people are so into it and why it's such a big subject and so many books and interpretations. But people have gotten a very good start to it, at least if they're looking to get into it some more. Do you have any other questions, Garrett?
I was going to ask the importance of why people need to make their own runes, but I think you guys already covered that.
Yeah, pretty much, with the whole humming and the will and then talking about ego and stuff like that.
Yeah. All right. So thank you for taking your time to be here and talk with Scott. And so if anybody watching this is interested in more of Scott's work, his YouTube channel and his books are all going to be linked in the description below. And I definitely recommend you should check him out. There's a lot more content than you'll find here there.
Awesome.
All right. Thank you again, Scott.
Yeah,
thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.